Welcome back to the channel. Today we are uncovering the most brutal cover-up in television history, Miss Kitty, Amanda Blake. She was America's wholesome sweetheart, yet she died of the era's most shameful plague. Hollywood told you it was cancer. It was a cold-blooded lie. Miss Kitty died of AIDS. Betrayed by a husband who lived a double life and terrified of the audience she loved, she spent her final years rotting in a prison of silence. The industry that built her pedestal chose to protect a brand rather than save a human, proving that in Tinseltown, a perfect image matters more than a dying woman's soul. Before there was Miss Kitty, there was Beverly. Born on February 20th, 1929, in Buffalo, New York, Beverly Louise Neal entered the world on the precipice of the Great Depression. She was the only child of Jesse and Louise Neal. Her father, a banker, provided a life of relative stability in an era of economic chaos. But the Neal household was not one of stifling convention. There was a streak of independence in the family, a desire for something beyond the gray skies of upstate New York. Beverly was not the typical child star in waiting. She was not pushed onto vaudeville stages by a stage mother or paraded through beauty pageants. Her early years were defined by a rigorous education and a burgeoning, almost wild love for nature. This connection to the natural world would become the single most consistent thread in her life, arguably more important to her than acting ever was. When the family moved to Claremont, California during her teenage years, the shift in geography sparked a shift in temperament. California in the 1940s was a land of infinite promise, bathed in sunlight and the glow of the nearby dream factories of Los Angeles. Beverly attended Claremont High School, where the drama bug first bit. But unlike many of her contemporaries who saw acting as a pathway to vanity, Beverly approached it with a surprising academic rigor. She enrolled at Pomona College, a prestigious liberal arts institution, but her hunger for the stage soon outpaced her patience for the classroom. She transferred to the chaotic, vibrant world of full-time acting pursuit. It is important to note that the Beverly Neal of the late 1940s was not the Miss Kitty the world would come to know. She was a redhead with a fire in her belly, possessing a striking, angular beauty that was distinct from the soft blonde bombshells that were beginning to dominate the screen. She had a sharp jawline, piercing eyes, and a voice that carried a natural husky authority. Her first major step into the industry was not through a lucky break at a soda fountain, but through the grind of the studio system. MGM, the roaring lion of Hollywood, signed her to a contract. In the late 40s, a studio contract was both a golden ticket and a pair of handcuffs. It meant a weekly salary, acting lessons, and access to the best wardrobe departments in the world. But it also meant you were property. The studio decided your name, your hair color, who you dated for publicity, and what movies you appeared in. Beverly Louise Neal was dead. Amanda Blake was born. The early career of Amanda Blake is a study in frustration. Hollywood knew she was talented, but they didn't quite know what to do with her. She wasn't an ingenue in the traditional sense. She wasn't a femme fatale. She had a strength that was difficult to cast in the rigid gender roles of post-war cinema. Her film debut came in 1950 with Stars in My Crown, a Western. It was a prophetic genre for her, though she didn't know it at the time. She played small roles, the other woman, or the plucky girl next door. She appeared in Duchess of Idaho and Lily, films that are remembered today, but not for her contributions. Perhaps the most bizarre entry in her early filmography, and a testament to the indignities young actresses had to endure, was the 1954 film Miss Robin Crusoe. In a desperate attempt to capitalize on the adventure craze, the studio cast Amanda as a female version of Robinson Crusoe. She spent the film running around a jungle set in a ragged dress, fighting off threats and looking picturesque in distress. It was campy, it was forgettable, and it was the kind of role that kills careers. Amanda Blake was in danger of becoming just another almost famous face, destined to fade into the background of B-movies. However, the landscape of entertainment was shifting beneath the studio's feet. Television, once dismissed as a fad or a poor man's cinema, was exploding. By 1955, TV was no longer a novelty. It was the dominant cultural force in America. The networks were hungry for content, and they were looking for something that could glue families to their sets for an hour every week. CBS had a property that was already a massive hit on the radio, Gunsmoke. Gunsmoke on the radio was a dark, gritty, psychological drama. It was often called Hamlet on the Hudson for its somber tone and complex scripts. The character of Kitty Russell in the radio version, voiced by Georgia Ellis, was undeniably a prostitute. The show didn't shy away from the harsh realities of the frontier. When CBS decided to adapt it for television, they faced a massive problem: censorship. You could imply things on the radio that you could never show on 1950s television. The visual medium required a sanitation of the West. Matt Dillon couldn't just be a brooding killer. He had to be a hero. And Kitty Russell couldn't be a madam. She had to be a hostess. The casting of Gunsmoke is the stuff of Hollywood legend. John Wayne famously recommended James Arness for the role of Matt Dillon, arguably saving the show before it began. Arness was a towering physical presence, but he needed a foil. He needed a woman who could stand up to him, not physically, but spiritually. Dozens of actresses auditioned for the role of Miss Kitty. The producers needed someone who looked like she belonged in a saloon, but acted like she belonged in a church pew. It was a paradoxical demand, a woman of the night who was also a paragon of virtue. Amanda Blake walked into the audition room with nothing to lose. By 1955, her film career was stalling. She read the lines with Arness, and the chemistry was instant. It wasn't the fiery sexual tension of a romance novel. It was the comfortable, lived-in banter of an old married couple who had never actually married. Writer John Meston and producer Norman Macdonald saw it immediately. Amanda didn't play Kitty as a victim or a seductress. She played her as an equal. When she looked at the 6'7" James Arness, she didn't look up in awe. She looked him in the eye. She got the job. Gunsmoke premiered on September 10th, 1955. It was introduced by John Wayne himself, a blessing from the god of westerns. The show was slow to start, but by the end of its first season, it was a hit. By 1957, it was the #1 show in America, a position it would hold for 4 unprecedented years. For Amanda Blake, the transformation was total. She spent her days in corsets that were laced so tight she often had trouble breathing. She wore heavy wigs and pounds of makeup to withstand the harsh studio lights. But she crafted Miss Kitty into a 3-dimensional human being. In the early seasons, the writers struggled with Kitty. They often had her just standing at the bar asking Matt, "What'll you have, Marshall?" But Amanda fought for more. She infused the character with a backstory that was never written. You could see the weariness in her eyes, the history of a woman who had seen the worst of men and still decided to be kind. Miss Kitty became a fashion icon of the era, sparking trends in jewelry and hairstyles. But more importantly, she became a moral icon. In the 1950s and 60s, American society was rigid. Women were largely confined to the domestic sphere. Miss Kitty was different. She owned her own business. She carried a derringer in her garter. She took no nonsense from drunks, gamblers, or outlaws. Yet she was never unfeminine. She walked the tightrope of gender expectations perfectly. For the audience, the will they or won't they relationship between Matt and Kitty became the emotional anchor of the show. They never kissed passionately. They never married. It was a sublimated romance, expressed through concerned glances and shared cups of coffee. This restraint made it all the more powerful. It allowed every viewer to project their own desires onto the couple. But for Amanda Blake, the success of Gunsmoke was a double-edged sword. The money was incredible. She became one of the wealthiest women in television. She bought a large estate in Phoenix. She had fans screaming her name. But the work was grueling. Shooting a 1-hour drama in the 50s and 60s meant 16-hour days, 6 days a week. It meant living in a corset. It meant having no time for a personal life. And as the years dragged on, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, the line between Amanda Blake and Miss Kitty began to blur. The public didn't want to see Amanda Blake the animal lover or Amanda Blake the divorcee. They only wanted Miss Kitty. And Hollywood, seeing the cash cow they had created, was determined to keep Amanda in that box. She was no longer an actress exploring a role. She was the custodian of a national treasure. By the mid-1960s, Gunsmoke was no longer just a television show. It was a piece of American furniture. It had survived the transition from the intimacy of the 1950s to the turbulent social revolution of the 1960s. While the real world outside was burning with the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, and the counterculture revolution, Dodge City remained suspended in amber. It was a safe space where moral ambiguity was resolved within the hour, and where Amanda Blake's Miss Kitty stood as an unshakable pillar of consistency. However, the transition from black and white to color in 1966 marked a significant shift for Amanda. In black and white, the lighting could be manipulated to create shadows, mystery, and softness. Color was unforgiving. It revealed every line, every layer of makeup, and the vivid artificiality of the set. For an actress approaching her 40s in an industry obsessed with youth, the pressure intensified. Amanda Blake's routine during these peak years was a test of endurance that would have broken a lesser woman. Her alarm would ring at 4:30 a.m. By 5:30 a.m., she was in the makeup chair at the CBS studio lot. The transformation into Miss Kitty took nearly 2 hours. It involved heavy pancake makeup to withstand the searing heat of the studio lights, elaborate hairstyles that required structural engineering, and, most famously, the corset. The corset was the symbol of her success and the instrument of her torture. To achieve the hourglass silhouette demanded by the period costumes, Amanda was laced so tightly that she could barely eat during the day. She survived on coffee, cigarettes, and sheer willpower. Between takes, while James Arness and the male cast members could relax in their dusty trail clothes, Amanda had to sit on a special leaning board, a slanted plank that allowed her to rest without sitting down, because the corset made sitting in a normal chair agony. Yet on screen, she never showed a crack in the armor. She glided through the Long Branch Saloon with a regal grace. But behind the scenes, a quiet desperation was building. The role of Kitty Russell, while iconic, had become repetitive. The writers, focusing on the weekly guest stars or the action-heavy plots for Matt Dillon, often reduced Kitty to a background player. She was there to react, to worry, to pour drinks. For an actress who had once studied Shakespeare and dreamed of dramatic complexity, being the world's most famous glorified bartender was a golden cage. She was wealthy, yes. She was famous, undoubtedly. But she was artistically starving. And in the silence of that starvation, Amanda began to build a world of her own, one that had nothing to do with cowboys or cameras. If you drove past Amanda Blake's sprawling property in the desert hills of Arizona during the 1960s and 70s, you might see something that made you question your sanity. You wouldn't see poodles or horses. You might see a full-grown African cheetah lounging by the swimming pool, or a lion pacing in a custom-built enclosure. This was the real Amanda Blake. While Hollywood saw her as the domestic ideal of the Old West, Amanda was, at her core, a woman of the wild. Her obsession with animals went far beyond the typical celebrity pet ownership. It was a profound, almost spiritual connection to the primal world, perhaps a reaction to the artificial, controlled environment of the television studio. Her most famous companion was a cheetah named Chemo. Chemo was not a prop. He was family. Amanda had adopted him as a cub, and their bond was legendary. In an era before strict exotic animal laws, Amanda and Chemo were inseparable. There are surreal anecdotes of Amanda driving her convertible down the freeways of Los Angeles with a 120-pound cheetah sitting in the passenger seat, the wind blowing through his fur, watching the traffic with predatory indifference. She didn't just keep these animals, she studied them. She became a self-taught expert in the behavior and breeding of big cats. At her ranch, she established one of the first successful breeding programs for cheetahs in captivity in the United States. This was pioneering work. Cheetahs are notoriously difficult to breed in captivity. They are nervous, high-strung animals that require vast amounts of space and privacy. That Amanda Blake, a woman working 16-hour days on a TV set, could create an environment where these animals felt safe enough to reproduce is a testament to her extraordinary empathy and dedication. This passion project was her escape. When she was with Chemo or her lion or her pack of dogs, she wasn't Miss Kitty. She wasn't the property of CBS. She was just a human being connecting with another living soul. The animals didn't care about her ratings. They didn't care about her makeup. They demanded nothing but her presence. In interviews from this era, when asked about her animals, Amanda's face would light up in a way it rarely did when discussing Gunsmoke. "I prefer animals to people," she once famously quipped. "They are honest. If they don't like you, they walk away or they bite you. They don't smile at you while holding a knife behind their back." It was a telling statement. It revealed a cynicism about her human relationships, a cynicism that was, unfortunately, well-earned. The greatest fiction of Gunsmoke was not the gunfights or the clean streets of Dodge City. It was the relationship between Matt and Kitty. It was a relationship built on absolute trust, mutual respect, and unspoken devotion. It was the kind of love that every woman in America wanted, and the kind of love Amanda Blake desperately craved. But real life was not a script written by John Meston. Amanda's romantic life was a chaotic series of misfires. While she played the steadfast partner on TV, her off-screen life was a revolving door of husbands. She was married to Don Whitman from 1954 to 1956, then to Jason Seymour Day from 1964 to 1967, then to Frank Gilbert from 1967 to 1982. Each marriage followed a heartbreakingly similar pattern. The men were often attracted to the image of the star, the glamour, the wealth, the status, but they couldn't handle the reality of the woman. Amanda was strong-willed, independent, and often the primary breadwinner. In the mid-20th century, this dynamic was poison for the fragile male ego. Her marriage to Frank Gilbert was her longest lasting through the end of the Gunsmoke run. They shared a love for the animals and managed the breeding compound together. For a while, it seemed like she had finally found her balance. But even that relationship eventually crumbled under the weight of drifting interests and the pressures of her post-TV life. There's a profound tragedy in this contrast. Every week, millions of Americans tuned in to see Miss Kitty, the woman who understood men better than anyone. Yet the woman playing her went home to an empty bed or a failing marriage, surrounding herself with dangerous predators because they were safer than the men in her life. She was looking for a Matt Dillon, a protector, a stoic rock, but she kept finding men who wanted to own her, use her, or change her. This emotional instability created a void. And like many people in high-pressure environments, Amanda filled that void with a vice that was socially acceptable, readily available, and slowly killing her. If the corset was the symbol of her repression, the cigarette was the symbol of her rebellion. Amanda Blake was a smoker, but to say she was a smoker is an understatement. She was a devotee of tobacco. She smoked 2 to 3 packs a day. In the 1950s and 60s, this wasn't unusual. It was the norm. Humphrey Bogart smoked, Bette Davis smoked, Edward R. Murrow smoked. It was sophisticated. It was something to do with your hands. It was an appetite suppressant, crucial for fitting into those waist-cinching costumes. On the set of Gunsmoke, the air was thick with blue haze. Between takes, the moment the director yelled "cut," a production assistant would be there with a lighter. Amanda would inhale deeply, the smoke filling her lungs, providing a momentary hit of dopamine to calm the nerves and stave off the exhaustion. She didn't know, or perhaps chose to ignore, the biological time bomb she was nurturing. The science on smoking was becoming clearer in the 60s, culminating in the Surgeon General's report of 1964. But for a generation hooked on nicotine, the warnings were abstract. Cancer happened to other people. It didn't happen to stars. The cigarettes were her constant companion. They were there when the marriages failed. They were there during the long, boring waits on set. They were there when the anxiety of aging in Hollywood kept her awake at night. As the 1970s dawned, the cumulative effect of 20 years of chain smoking began to weave itself into her cellular structure. The cells in her mouth and throat, bombarded daily by carcinogens and heat, began to mutate. The tragedy was microscopic and silent, growing in the dark while the applause continued in the light. By 1974, the landscape of television had changed irrevocably. The era of the rural purge had begun. Network executives, looking at demographics, decided that shows about cowboys and farms appealed to older rural audiences that advertisers didn't care about. They wanted young, urban, hip viewers. They wanted All in the Family and MASH. Gunsmoke, despite still having decent ratings, was suddenly a dinosaur. It was expensive to produce, the cast was aging, and the cultural zeitgeist had moved on. For Amanda Blake, the writing was on the wall before the cancellation notice even arrived. The commute from her home in Phoenix to Los Angeles was becoming a burden. The joy of acting had been replaced by the drudgery of the routine. She was tired. She was wealthy enough to never work again, and the pull of her animal sanctuary was stronger than the pull of the studio. In 1974, after 19 seasons, Amanda Blake made the stunning decision to leave the show. She didn't wait for it to be canceled. She walked away. It was a move of immense power. She was effectively saying, "I am done being Miss Kitty. I want to be Amanda." The writers handled her exit abruptly. Miss Kitty simply left Dodge City. There was no grand death scene, no tearful wedding to Matt. She just left. It was an unsatisfying end for the fans, but for Amanda, it was a liberation. She retreated to her sanctuary in Phoenix, surrounded by the desert landscape she loved. She threw herself into the care of her animals. She expanded her cheetah breeding program, becoming a respected voice in the conservation community. To the outside observer, it looked like the perfect retirement. The Queen of the West had hung up her corset to live among the lions. But retirement for a workaholic is rarely peaceful. The silence of the desert was deafening compared to the chaotic energy of a soundstage. Amanda had spent 2 decades being the center of attention. Now she was just a woman in a big house with a lot of cats. The adrenaline withdrawal was real. Furthermore, the industry she left behind wasn't done with her. Hollywood has a short memory, but it also has a lingering grip. Offers trickled in, guest spots on game shows, cameos on the new wave of anthology series like The Love Boat and Fantasy Island. Amanda took them occasionally, needing the validation that she was still a working actress, not just a relic of a bygone era. But beneath the surface of this quiet life, a biological clock of a different kind was ticking down. The decades of chain smoking, the 2 packs of unfiltered cigarettes a day, the smoke-filled breaks on the set of Dodge City were about to exact their price. It started innocuously in 1976. A small sore on the inside of her cheek, a patch of white that wouldn't go away. For months, Amanda ignored it. Like many people of her generation, she was stoic about physical discomfort. She assumed it was stress or perhaps a canker sore from a rough tooth. She applied over-the-counter remedies and kept smoking. She kept living, but the sore grew. It became painful to eat. It began to affect her speech, a subtle thickening of the tongue that she tried to mask. Finally, under pressure from friends who noticed her discomfort, she visited a doctor in early 1977. The biopsy results were devastating. It was oral squamous cell carcinoma, mouth cancer. The diagnosis was a sledgehammer blow. In the 1970s, cancer was still whispered about, often referred to as the Big C. It was a terrifying, mysterious killer. For an actress, oral cancer was a particularly cruel sentence. Her face and her voice were her livelihood. This disease threatened to destroy both. The doctors were blunt. The cancer was aggressive. If they didn't operate immediately, she would die. But the surgery itself was brutal. It would require the removal of a significant portion of her tongue, part of her jaw, and the lymph nodes in her neck to ensure the cancer hadn't spread. Amanda Blake, the woman who had faced down gunslingers on TV and cheetahs in real life, was terrified. She was facing a disfigurement that could end her career and a surgery that could end her life. In February 1977, Amanda Blake went under the knife. The surgery took over 9 hours. When she woke up, the silence was absolute. She couldn't speak. Her mouth was swollen, stitched, and reconstructed. The pain was excruciating. The doctors had removed the malignant tissue, but the cost was high. She had to relearn how to swallow. She had to relearn how to move her mouth. For weeks, she communicated with a notepad and pen. The isolation was profound. She lay in her hospital bed, the famous red hair matted, the iconic voice silenced, wondering if Miss Kitty was dead forever. This is the moment where the character of Amanda Blake diverged sharply from the character she played. Miss Kitty was tough, but she was fictional. Amanda Blake had to find a reservoir of real courage that no scriptwriter could provide. She refused to hide. As the swelling went down, she began the grueling process of speech therapy. It was humiliating work. She had to make guttural sounds, practice simple vowels like a toddler, and train the remaining muscles of her tongue to compensate for what was lost. There were days she wanted to give up. The frustration of not being able to articulate a simple sentence was maddening for a woman known for her sharp wit. But she persisted. Slowly the slur diminished. The clarity returned. It wasn't the exact same voice. It was slightly raspier, a little slower, but it was hers. Most celebrities in Amanda's position would have retreated permanently. They would have hidden the scars in the lisp, protecting the pristine image of their youth. Amanda Blake did the opposite. Once she was declared cancer-free, she went on the offensive. She realized that her suffering had a purpose. She had been a smoker for 25 years. She was the living embodiment of the consequences of tobacco. She contacted the American Cancer Society and offered herself as a weapon. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, the anti-smoking movement was just beginning to gain real traction. Having a beloved TV icon like Amanda Blake step forward was a coup. She traveled across the country, walking into auditoriums and TV studios. She would point to her jaw, to the subtle scar on her neck, and say, "Look at me. This is what smoking does." She was fearless. She testified before legislative committees. She spoke to high school students who were just picking up their first cigarettes. She stripped away the glamour of Hollywood smoking and revealed the brutality of the surgery. It was a redemption arc. The public fell in love with her all over again. They didn't just see her as the saloon keeper anymore. They saw her as a survivor. She was honored by the American Cancer Society with their highest award. In 1984, President Ronald Reagan, a man she had known from the old Hollywood days, presented her with the Courage Award. For a brief moment, Amanda Blake was on top of the world. She had defeated death. She had found a new purpose. She was hailed as a hero. But tragedy often waits in the wings of triumph. While her public life was filled with awards and applause, her private life remained a desolate landscape. Her fourth marriage to Frank Gilbert had disintegrated. They divorced in 1982. Once again, Amanda was alone. She was now in her 50s. The cancer battle had aged her. She was thinner. The stress of the recovery and the divorce took a toll on her physical vitality. While she was cancer-free, her immune system had taken a battering from the years of smoking and the aggressive treatment. She returned to the dating pool, but with a sense of weariness. She was tired of the temporary men, the ones who wanted a trophy. She wanted a partner. She wanted someone who could match her status, someone who didn't need her money, someone who was a grown-up. She wanted safety. This desire for safety, for a safe harbor after the storms of cancer and divorce, blinded her. It made her vulnerable. When you are desperate for a happy ending, you often ignore the red flags in the opening act. In 1983, Amanda met Mark Spaeth. On the surface, Mark Spaeth was the answer to her prayers. He was based in Austin, Texas. He was a city councilman deeply embedded in the political machinery of the state. He was a developer, a man of means. He was 45 years old, younger than Amanda, but distinguished with silver hair and impeccable manners. He was charming. He was attentive. He treated her not just as a star, but as a lady. He courted her with the old-school romance that she had missed. He flew her to Texas, introduced her to the high society of Austin. He showed her a world of political galas, black-tie dinners, and respectability. It was a seductive change from Hollywood. In Austin, she wasn't just an aging actress. She was a prospective political wife. It felt dignified. It felt secure. But Mark Spaeth was a man of secrets. Austin in the 1980s was a complex place, a blue dot in a red state, but still deeply conservative in its social structures. A man in Mark Spaeth's position, a public figure, a politician, had to maintain a certain image. Mark Spaeth was gay. In 1984, being an openly gay politician in Texas was political suicide. It was simply not an option. Mark lived a double life. There was the public Mark, the civic leader, the developer, the bachelor, and there was the private Mark, a man who frequented the underground gay scene, who had discreet relationships with men. We will never know the exact nature of his intent when he met Amanda. Was he looking for a beard, a famous wife to deflect rumors about his sexuality? Was he genuinely fond of her and thought they could have a companionate marriage? Or was he a sociopath looking for a wealthy woman to fund his lifestyle? Whatever his motives, he didn't tell her the truth. He didn't tell her about the men, And more fatally, he didn't tell her about the new mysterious illness that was beginning to circulate in the communities he secretly visited. Amanda, blinded by the hope of a final stable love, saw only the polished exterior. She saw the suit, the smile, the stability. She said yes. On April 28th, 1984, Amanda Blake and Mark Spaeth were married. It was a small, tasteful ceremony. Amanda looked radiant, relieved. She sold her beloved animal compound in Arizona, a massive sacrifice that signaled her total commitment to this new life, and moved to Austin. She became Mrs. Mark Spaeth. She threw herself into the role of the political spouse. She hosted fundraisers. She attended city council meetings. She tried to blend into the Texas aristocracy. But almost immediately, cracks began to appear. The marriage was not the romantic idyll she had envisioned. Mark was often distant. There were unexplained absences. The intimacy she craved was lacking. Amanda, ever the stoic, likely rationalized this. She was older. He was busy. Perhaps this was just what marriage was at their age. But the real horror wasn't emotional neglect. It was biological. By 1984, the HIV virus was spreading rapidly, though testing was not yet commonplace or reliable. Mark Spaeth had been exposed. He carried the virus in his blood, and in the intimacy of their marriage, however infrequent, he passed that virus to Amanda. It is a chilling thought. The woman who had just spent years warning America about the dangers of smoking, a visible known enemy, was now sleeping next to an invisible silent killer. She had beaten cancer, only to be infected with a death sentence in her own marital bed. The tragedy is compounded by the betrayal. Mark Spaeth almost certainly knew deep down that he was at risk. The rumors of the gay cancer were rampant in the communities he frequented. By marrying Amanda without disclosing his lifestyle, he stripped her of her agency. He took away her right to choose her own risk. She thought she was starting a new chapter. In reality, she was starting the final countdown. 1985 was the turning point. It was the year America finally looked AIDS in the face, largely due to the shocking revelation of Rock Hudson's diagnosis. Hudson, a pillar of masculinity and a contemporary of Amanda's, showed the world that the virus could strike the gods of Hollywood. For Amanda, watching the Hudson News must have been a surreal horror. Rock was a friend. He was part of her world. Seeing him gaunt, hollow-eyed, and terrified was a splash of cold water, but the horror was closer to home. Mark Spaeth was deteriorating rapidly. By the spring of 1985, he was no longer just run down. He was dying. The official diagnosis within the household remained vague. Doctors in Texas, protective of a prominent local figure, spoke in euphemisms. They treated the symptoms. They treated the pneumonia. They treated the infections. But the whispers in Austin's social circles were becoming a roar. Mark Spaeth was one of the silent casualties of the early epidemic. He was a man trapped by the rigid homophobia of his era. To admit he had AIDS was to admit he was gay. To admit he was gay was to destroy his reputation, his family's standing, and his wife's dignity. So, he chose silence. He chose to let Amanda believe he was simply unlucky, a victim of a mysterious constitutional failure. He allowed her to nurse him, to wipe his brow, to hold his hand, all while carrying the secret that he had exposed her to the very thing that was killing him. It is difficult to judge Mark Spaeth with modern eyes. He was a frightened man in a frightening time, but his fear drove him to an act of supreme selfishness. He denied Amanda the truth. He denied her the chance to protect herself, or at least to understand what was happening to her own life. In the spring of 1985, Mark Spaeth died. The official cause of death was listed as pneumonia. pneumocystis carinii pneumonia, to be exact. To those in the know, PCP was the signature of AIDS. It was the opportunistic infection that killed immune-compromised patients. But to the general public reading the obituary in the Austin American-Statesman, it was just a tragedy. A young politician cut down in his prime. For the fourth time, a marriage had ended in tragedy, leaving Amanda once again solitary and searching. The funeral was a somber affair. Amanda played the part she knew best, the stoic, grieving survivor. She accepted the condolences of the Texas elite. She stood by the grave dressed in black, her face a mask of composed sorrow. But beneath the surface, she was reeling. The marriage had lasted less than a year. She had uprooted her life, sold her beloved Cheetah compound, and moved across the country for this? For a few months of awkward marriage and a funeral? She felt foolish. She felt used. But she still didn't know the full extent of the damage. After the funeral, the reality of Mark's finances and life began to emerge. It wasn't the fairy tale she thought, but more importantly, the physical toll of the stress began to manifest in her own body. She decided to leave Austin. The city was full of ghosts and whispers. She couldn't walk into a restaurant without feeling the eyes of the locals on her. That's the TV star whose husband died. You know what he had, don't you? She couldn't bear the pity. She packed up again. She returned to California, to the only place she felt safe, near her friends, near the industry, near the memory of who she used to be. Amanda Blake returned to California in late 1985. She was 56 years old. She told friends she was exhausted from the grief. She told them the stress of nursing Mark had worn her out. But this was different. This wasn't just tiredness. This was a bone-deep fatigue that sleep couldn't touch. She started having persistent diarrhea. She lost her appetite. The weight, which she had fought to keep down for 20 years for the cameras, was now falling off her effortlessly and terrifyingly. She had survived oral cancer. She knew what illness felt like. She knew the feeling of her body betraying her, but this felt systemic. She developed thrush, a yeast infection in the mouth and throat. It was painful. It reminded her of the cancer radiation burns. Panic set in. Was the cancer back? Had the smoking finally caught up with her again? She went to her doctors. They ran tests. They looked for tumors. They looked for metastasis. They found nothing. No tumors, no new cancer, but her white blood cell count was dangerously low. Her body had no defenses. She was catching every cold, every flu. A scratch would take weeks to heal. The doctors were puzzled at first. Amanda Blake was a wealthy, heterosexual woman in her 50s. She didn't fit the profile. In 1985, doctors were trained to look for HIV in young gay men or intravenous drug users. They were not looking for it in Miss Kitty. Sometime in 1986, the pieces fell into place. Perhaps a doctor, more astute than the others, looked at her medical history. Widow. Husband died of pneumonia at 45 in Austin. Persistent thrush. Wasting syndrome. The question was asked. The blood was drawn. The ELISA test was run. The result was positive. Amanda Blake sat in a doctor's office and was told she had the plague. Not cancer, which was noble, not heart disease. She had AIDS, the disease of the pariah, the disease of the sinner. The realization must have been a cascade of horrors. First, the shock. How? Then, the realization. Mark. The betrayal hit her with the force of a physical blow. The man she had married, the man she had trusted with her life, had killed her. He had known, or at least suspected, and he had said nothing. He had used her as a shield, and in doing so, he had turned her body into a tomb. Then came the shame, the overwhelming, crushing shame. Amanda Blake was a woman of the 1950s. She valued propriety above all else. She was a Republican. She was a role model. She was the woman who taught America that ladies could be tough but remained ladies. How could she tell the world she had AIDS? The tabloids would destroy her. They would paint her as a sexually promiscuous woman, or they would drag Mark's name through the mud, detailing his secret life. They would turn her tragedy into a sordid scandal. National Enquirer headlines danced in her head, Miss Kitty's deadly secret. She couldn't do it. She simply couldn't facing the public. She made a decision right there in the doctor's office. A decision that would define her remaining years. She would lie. Amanda Blake swore her doctors to secrecy. In California, patient confidentiality is sacred, but in Hollywood, leaks are currency. She found a small team of medical professionals she trusted implicitly. She constructed a narrative. To her friends, to her family, and to the press, she was suffering from the long-term effects of her cancer treatment. Or she had hepatitis. Or liver trouble. These were plausible lies. She did have liver issues. She did have a history of cancer. It was easy to sell. People wanted to believe it. No one wanted to believe Miss Kitty had AIDS. She retreated to her home in Sacramento. She began to isolate herself. She stopped accepting most social invitations. She stopped doing interviews. The isolation was a protective measure, but it was also a prison. By hiding her diagnosis, she cut herself off from support. She couldn't join a support group. She couldn't talk to a therapist openly. She couldn't cry on a friend's shoulder and say, "Oh, I'm scared of dying." She had to pretend she was just under the weather. The mental toll was catastrophic. She was grieving her husband, grieving her own life, and dealing with a rage toward Mark that she had nowhere to direct. And physically, the virus was relentless. Without the antiretroviral drugs that would be developed in the mid-90s, HIV was a slow, agonizing march toward death. It stripped away her energy, her muscle mass, her cognitive sharpness. Yet, even in this state, Hollywood came knocking one last time. In 1987, CBS decided to cash in on nostalgia. They greenlit Gunsmoke, returned to Dodge. It was to be a triumphant reunion. James Arness was back. The production values were high. They wanted the whole gang. They called Amanda. Her agent likely hesitated. Amanda was sick. She looked sick. But Amanda said yes. Why? Perhaps she needed the money. Her medical bills were astronomical, and she was paying for them privately to avoid insurance paper trails that might leak. Perhaps she wanted to prove she was still alive. Perhaps she just wanted to see Matt Dillon one last time. But when she arrived on set in Canada, the cast and crew were shocked. The woman who walked out of the trailer was not the voluptuous, sturdy Miss Kitty of 1970. She was a wraith. She was frail. Her skin was papery. Her eyes were sunken. The makeup department went into overdrive. They used layers of foundation to give her color. They padded her costumes to give her curves. They used lighting tricks to hide the sharp angles of her face. Amanda summoned every ounce of her training. She smiled. She joked. She delivered her lines with that familiar husky twang. But between takes, she collapsed into her chair. She was breathless. She was in pain. Watching Return to Dodge is a haunting experience if you know the truth. You are watching a dying woman pretending to be a living legend. There is a scene where she looks at Matt Dillon with a wistful sadness. It feels less like acting and more like a goodbye. She finished the shoot. She wrapped the movie. She said goodbye to James Arness, likely knowing she would never see him again. She went back to Sacramento, closed the door, and prepared to die. The period from 1987 to 1989 was a slow fade. Amanda's world shrank to the size of her bedroom. She had her dogs. She had a few loyal friends who, by now, suspected the truth but loved her enough not to say the word. She was in constant contact with Dr. Lou Nishimura, her primary physician in Sacramento. They managed the pain. They managed the infections, but there was no cure. There was no hope of remission. Amanda Blake's death was not a sudden event. It was an erosion. The woman who had once driven a cheetah down the highway could now barely walk to the bathroom. The voice that had commanded a saloon was now a whisper, but she remained the director of her own scene until the end. She dictated how her death would be handled. No press, no spectacle. The hours immediately following Amanda Blake's death on August 16th, 1989, played out exactly according to the script she had so carefully written in her final years. The machinery of Hollywood publicity, even for a retired star, is efficient and unsentimental. Press releases were typed up, phone calls were made to the major wire services, and the obituaries that had been pre-written and stored in the archives of the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times were pulled, updated, and published. The narrative was consistent, safe, and tragic in a palatable way. The headlines announced that Miss Kitty Russell, the beloved proprietress of the Long Branch Saloon, had succumbed to complications from oral cancer or perhaps liver failure. It was a story that America understood. It was a hero's death, the final chapter of a woman who had fought a brave public battle against the ravages of smoking. It allowed the public to mourn her with a clean, uncomplicated grief, shaking their heads at the cruelty of cancer while celebrating her resilience. In living rooms across the country, fans replayed memories of Gunsmoke, imagining Amanda reuniting with the cowboys in the sky. The tributes were glowing. Friends from the industry spoke of her love for animals, her gritty work ethic, and her kindness. But in the private corridors of Sacramento's Mercy General Hospital and in the quiet home of Dr. Lou Nishimura, a different reality was suffocating those who knew the truth. They were holding a secret that felt less like a medical diagnosis and more like a moral hand grenade. They knew that the woman being eulogized as a cancer victim had actually died with her immune system obliterated by HIV. They knew that the liver failure was merely the final domino to fall in a cascade of destruction caused by AIDS. The silence that Amanda had demanded during her life now hung over her death like a shroud. And for a few days, it seemed that the lie would become the permanent historical record. However, the burden of maintaining this deception began to weigh heavily on Dr. Nishimura. As a physician, he was bound by the ethics of patient confidentiality, a sacred trust that extends even beyond the grave. But he was also a doctor practicing in 1989, a year when the AIDS epidemic was at its most terrifying and misunderstood. He saw the way the disease was dismissed by politicians and demonized by religious leaders. He saw how the victims were categorized into guilty and innocent, with the vast majority being cast into the darkness of social pariah status. He realized that by allowing Amanda Blake's death to be mislabeled, he was contributing to the very stigma that had forced her to die in isolation. If a woman of Amanda Blake's stature, wealthy, white, heterosexual, and beloved, could be erased by the shame of AIDS, then what hope was there for anyone else? The silence was not protecting her dignity. It was validating the prejudice that killed her spirit long before the virus killed her body. The decision to speak was not made lightly. It was a professional risk and a personal betrayal of his patient's final wish. But Nishimura and a small circle of Amanda's closest confidants came to a profound realization. The truth was the only way to honor the totality of her suffering. To lie about her death was to let Mark Spaeth's betrayal have the final word. It was to let the virus win in the shadows. So in a move that would send shockwaves through the global media, the decision was made to correct the record. It was a courageous gamble, trusting that the public's love for Miss Kitty was strong enough to withstand the terrifying reality of the plague. The announcement came shortly after the funeral, a stark clinical correction to the flowing tributes. The Sacramento County Coroner's Office, armed with the medical facts provided by her physicians, issued a statement that stripped away the euphemisms. Amanda Blake had died of CMV hepatitis, a condition brought on by acquired immune deficiency syndrome. The words AIDS appeared next to the name Amanda Blake on the ticker tapes of newsrooms around the world. The reaction was immediate and visceral. It was a cultural earthquake. In 1989, AIDS was synonymous with Rock Hudson, with Freddie Mercury, with grim images of emaciated young men in San Francisco wards. It was not synonymous with the American West. It was not synonymous with the woman who poured beer for Matt Dillon. The media frenzy that followed was a mix of confusion, denial, and sensationalism. Tabloid reporters descended hungry for a scandal. The initial assumption in the darkest corners of the press was that Amanda must have had a secret life of her own. Was she a drug user? Was she promiscuous? The narrative of the innocent victim had not yet fully formed in the public consciousness. People struggled to reconcile the image of the wholesome saloon keeper with the gritty reality of the virus. The cognitive dissonance was palpable. For many Americans, this was the first time they were forced to acknowledge that HIV was not a moral judgment on a specific lifestyle, but a biological entity that could enter any home, any marriage, and any bloodstream. This is where Amanda's true friends stepped in to shield her legacy from the mudslinging. Pat Darby, a fellow animal activist and one of Amanda's closest allies, became the voice of clarity in the chaotic media storm. Darby and others made the difficult decision to expose the private tragedy of Amanda's marriage to Mark Spaeth. They told the story of the whirlwind romance, the political ambition, the closeted sexuality, and the silent betrayal. This contextualization was crucial. It shifted the narrative from one of scandal to one of heartbreak. Amanda was painted not as a participant in high-risk behavior, but as a casualty of trust. She became the face of a new demographic of victims, the unsuspecting wives. The revelation of Mark Spaeth's role did more than just clear Amanda's name. It indicted the culture of silence that had surrounded gay life in conservative America. It forced a conversation about the down-low lifestyle, about the pressure on men to marry to maintain political viability, and the deadly collateral damage of living a lie. The true antagonist of this tragedy was not merely the virus, but the culture of the closet itself, a suffocating fear that forced a man to hide his true nature, ultimately sentencing his wife to a silent, lonely death. As the truth settled in, the public reaction began to shift from shock to a profound melancholic empathy. The letters that poured into newspapers and TV stations changed tone. They weren't judging her. They were horrified for her. The image of the tough-as-nails Miss Kitty dying alone, afraid to tell anyone she was sick because she feared their judgment, held a mirror up to American society. It made people ask, what kind of world have we built where a dying woman feels she has to hide? The tragedy of her death became a powerful tool for education. Activists used her story to hammer home the message that AIDS was everyone's problem. If it could happen to Miss Kitty, it could happen to your grandmother, your sister, your neighbor. However, the tragedy was not just sociological. It was deeply personal for those who had worked with her. The cast of Gunsmoke, particularly James Arness, was reportedly devastated. They had lost a colleague, but now they had to grapple with the knowledge that she had suffered in such profound isolation. The realization that she had filmed Return to Dodge while knowing she was HIV positive, hiding her pain behind layers of makeup and a smile, recast that movie from a nostalgic reunion into a harrowing document of endurance. Every scene she was in now carried the weight of a goodbye she couldn't speak. The sheer physical grit required to ride a horse and recite lines while dying of AIDS was a testament to the iron will that had always defined Amanda Blake. In the weeks following the revelation, the conversation about Amanda Blake transformed. She ceased to be just a television star and became a martyr for the cause of awareness. But it was a martyrdom she never asked for and actively tried to avoid. This is the central paradox of her legacy. Her greatest impact on the world might not have been the 19 years she spent on screen, but the few days after her death when the truth was forced into the light. The breaking of the glass mask didn't destroy her image. It humanized it in a way that no scriptwriter ever could. It replaced the fictional strength of Miss Kitty with the tragic, vulnerable human reality of Amanda Blake. In the end, Amanda Blake did not die merely from a virus. She died from the crushing weight of her own perfection. The final act of her life was a harrowing performance of endurance. For 2 years, she lived inside a paradox. She was a woman whose soul belonged to the wild, to the cheetahs, and the open desert. Yet she chose to die in the suffocating cage of social expectation. She had spent 19 years building the monument of Miss Kitty, a symbol of unshakable moral strength. And when the cracks appeared in her own life, she was too terrified to let the world see them. She looked in the mirror and saw a choice. She could be Amanda, betrayed, sick, frightened, and human, and risk the pity of the public she had courted for decades. Or she could remain the icon, stoic, flawless, and distant, and endure her disintegration in solitary confinement. She chose the character over herself. The tragedy of Amanda Blake is not just that she was betrayed by a husband who used her as a shield for his own secrets. The deeper tragedy is that she did not trust that she was loved enough to be broken. She believed her value lay entirely in her strength, so she denied herself the comfort of empathy. She denied her friends the chance to say a true goodbye. She denied herself the peace of unburdening her soul. She wore the mask of Miss Kitty until the very last breath, protecting the franchise, protecting the memory of the saloon, and protecting the illusion of the Old West, while the woman named Beverly Neal withered away in the dark. When the silence finally broke, it was too late for her to hear the forgiveness and love that would have greeted her. The saloon doors have swung shut. The lights are out in Dodge City. Stripped of the corset, the wig, and the fear, all that remains is the woman herself, no longer an icon, no longer a victim, finally real, finally resting, finally free.